Now, dear colleagues, we're moving to the actual work. The first panel is called Innovative Technologies of Geospatial Data Acquisition. I'll be moderating it. I'd like to invite to this stage the speakers, which is Alexander Litvintcev, advisor of the head of the Federal Service for State Registration, Cadastre and Cartography, Ju Hyun Hee, team leader from the National Geographic Information Institute from the Republic of Korea, and Elena Kravtsova, lead engineer photogrammetrist from Rosreestr, Russia. Dear colleagues, please take your seats on the stage.
И мы вот очень хорошо идем в графике, прям замечательно, да. И
we're perfectly on time here, and the first presentation will be made by Alexander Litvintcev. Please take the rostrum. It will be much more convenient for you to speak from there. You have the pointer, which will help you page through the slides as well. And Mr. Litvintcev will tell you about the Russian cadastral system and experience of using STEREOphotogrammetric models. Good morning, dear colleagues. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference. As it had been mentioned, it's a traditional conference with huge history, and it gives me pleasure that I was invited here. Perhaps I won't be mistaken if I say that for the first time from the Rosreestr, we've been participating in it. Maybe something was in the past, but I don't remember. From the colleagues who work with me, I couldn't find a single participant of past conferences. Anyway, I'm sure it is a significant event that the agency responsible for cartography or geodesy or mapping products is showing interest to photogrammetric methods, Earth remote sensing, and a bit later I will tell you why. It is a huge honor for me to speak in front of you professionals. I do not consider myself a big professional of photogrammetry. We are more on the user side, or rather potential users, and one of the tasks for our participation in this conference is to turn ourselves from potential users into active and constant users of the products generated by Earth remote sensing, like STEREOphotogrammetric methods.
A few words about the history of my agency. It was founded 11 years ago by merging 3 other agencies. One was responsible for mapping, the other was responsible for registration of property rights, and the Rosreestr real estate, which covered various plots of land and carried out land supervision. Since 2017, the law on the state registration of land real estate was put into force. A few words about key provisions. This is Unified State Register of Real Property, meaning real property per se and property rights. It also means a unified procedure where you can apply for cadastral and real property rights. And the exterritoriality principle is embedded into it. You can apply with your application anywhere in Russia to have your real property registered. Back at the day, it was quite groundbreaking. It was also challenging, and as we embraced other systems, we realized that not all the countries follow it in the same way, and they don't even plan it in the same way. A few words about composition of information. So property units include type of property unit, cadastral number, land category, information about the form of ownership. Plus, there are elements of the boundary. I mean, is it the state boundary or a territory with a special status, protective boundary, protective area? Also, some additional data can be included in the cadastral data. That includes land plot layout, land plots to be sold on the auction. The red lines indicate minimum distances to gas pipelines. We also have building lines and some areas that are free of any structures.
Кадастра недвижимости, который появился буквально
Now I would like to mention a thing that appeared just 3 years ago. Being aware that the cadastre is filled up based on notification principle, so the pace is quite slow. At the moment, 54% of land plots have data about their boundaries. The rest are the land plots that emerged as a result of the land reform back in 1990s, so they have been registered without any spatial data. The government is not happy with that, so it sought ways to expedite the process of increasing content of the cadastre. And one of the shifts in the legislation was the provision on performing comprehensive cadastral works or complex cadastral works. And they are performed simultaneously for all real property units located on the territory of one or more cadastral blocks. And they include streets, squares, plazas, with all the coordinates of all the structures. As you may remember, the technical stock-taking system did not have the capability of coordinates of different buildings. So I'd like to share with you now the experience of using stereographic approach or method to doing such works. I say again in 2017 and in 2018 we started using the photogrammetric method. It was not our obvious choice. It's not provided for in any pieces of legislation, but an assumption was made, later substantiated with evidence that you can carry out large-scale cadastral work by utilizing photogrammetry. What are the advantages or benefits of it? If we take land survey methods or ground methods, these are all ground-based modalities. Orthophoto plans have some benefits, so I think this is obvious for experts knowledgeable in the field, but not for those who are engaged in cadastral works. Shooting an area from different angles reveals the true position of hidden points. I tried to depict that on this diagram. The orthophoto plan shows some false points. I mean, we don't see the foundation where the house touches the ground. As a result of efforts conducted, the actual boundaries of land plots can be identified in 40% of cases. the actual coordinates of the buildings in 32% of cases, whereas photogrammetry delivered higher percentages, 86 for land plots and 76 for structures accordingly. So effectively, with good conditions, with no thick foliage, we can bring it up to 90% for coordinates of areas of interest in in-house conditions. I wanted to draw your attention to a kind of a paradox. Stereophoto model has been in use for many years, but mostly as an interim material to create orthophoto plan. Here you can see a succession of stages, and if you would home in on the third stage, getting stereo models. That is, this is one of the stages to create an orthophoto plan. So it turns out that to create an in-house model costs 3 to 5 times less than to generate an orthophoto plan. And it is often given to the end customer as an orthophoto plan, and stereo model is used only as a working model sitting with the subcontractor. So for us, the end users, orthophoto plans were ordered some 10, 12 years ago. They were very popular back then. But stereo models of terrain is something that we still don't have at our agency. And the reliability of object detection is much higher in this case. I will elaborate on it in the slides to come. So here's how the technology breaks down. There is aerial photography, then in-house processing of aerial photographs, creating stereo models with an accuracy of 10 centimeters, coordination of land plots, and storage and management. We had a debate as to what kind of sensors are to be used, but I guess it's slightly beside the point for this session. Still, I'll give you the bottom line. I guess there are some economic, cost-effective considerations to be taken into account, and this could be UAVs or manned equipment. It depends on a particular mission, availability of flight permits. It has to be handled on a case-by-case basis. Because if we look at the outcomes in terms of accuracies and resolutions, I mean, there is a world of difference between unmanned aerial systems and manned systems. A couple of other benefits in favor of STEREOphotogrammetric method, because there is an error that can crop up if you do aerial survey at a certain angle, whereas stereo models deliver the true position of the base of the fence in this case. As for dense multi-storied buildings, by using STEREOphotogrammetric method, we can handle balconies aprons around buildings, which is something that orthophoto plans cannot deliver. Then we have private residential development and gardens, the outlines of the objects, capital construction. It helps identify points accurately, even with the foliage and some other barriers obstructing the view. So what's the summary, very briefly? The coordinates of specific points of real property units can be determined by using photogrammetric method. The results of aerial photography from both manned and unmanned aerial vehicles are used. Decoding and measurement of characteristic points of real property in settlement shall be carried out on stereo models. The stereogrammetric method is in line with the legislation, and when used camerally, it delivers up to 90% of the characteristic points of real property. And any field work on the extraction of characteristic points by a land survey can be minimized. The technique of stereophotogrammetric measurements is more simple in comparison with measurements of orthophoto plans due to the great number of decoding features of objects. Orthophoto plans are not suitable for determination of characteristic points, coordinates of borders, of land plots, and contours of real property units. So one might say that photogrammetric method is an accurate and reliable tool for the performance and acceptance of cadastral works, including comprehensive cadastral works. The use of photogrammetric materials ensures the uniformity of measurements. I would like to add that it is useful not only for the cadastre to be filled up. Perhaps it's Russian specifics that come into play, but this method is used for a variety of applied purposes, and the experience of 2016 and 17 shows that there is a continuing interest in the results generated by stereophotogrammetric method, and those areas include land management, urban development activities, land inventory, monitoring compliance with environmental legislation, safety issues, housing and utility services, smart city, so this is where this method has been put into use already in a number of towns of Bashkortostan, in Sverdlovsk region. This year we are targeting Kaliningrad region heavily, so we can expect the penetration of this approach in the works of the government. A few other messages about how the method works. So an aerial photography creates stereo models, then 1 to 500 topographic maps are created, then coordinates are determined of the borders of land plots, and in the meantime the project of surveying project stays with relevant stakeholders. Thus far 239 localities have been imaged with this in Bashkortostan. A couple of dozen hundreds of cadastral blocks It is also used for spatial planning. And to conclude, I'd like to thank Ural-Siberian Geoinformation Campaign because this presentation relied heavily on their outcomes. I'd like to speak with confidence that as an agency we're planning to pay more attention to stereographic models of terrains and use it not only for comprehensive cadastral works but also to rectify cadastral errors, which is another topical issue. So we will introduce more cleanliness in the cadastre with this. And speaking about the mapping and cadastral law and about the materials that are considered as the basis of the cadastre that are kept in the federal foundation of the cadastre, I expect the STEREOphotogrammetric models next to digital maps of smaller scale, orthophoto plans and other products to take their worthy spot. Thank you. Thank you, Konstantin. Your questions, please. Olga has a question. Olga Gershenzon. Considering this comprehensive role of orthophoto plans, will they be made available for other agencies or, I fear to say, for other businesses? Perhaps you could make open data sets for other businesses to develop on, or is it not attainable at the moment? I think it depends on whether we take strides or small steps in achieving this. There is a Chinese proverb where if you make baby steps, only small barriers will be encountered by you. Or the Russian version states, if you make big steps, then you're likely to have your pants ripped off. We have the Federal Foundation of Special Data, regional foundations, but we don't know in all the situations what information is available for a specific area of interest, because we have large state corporations or other big players, and we don't know where the materials are stored. The general principle goes that the Federal Foundation works in such a way so that it is free of charge for the government. Those organizations that do government commissioned projects can also get this data for free. As for commercial players, businesses, it's not available. Unfortunately, the data purchased earlier is not available to anybody. 17 million square kilometers of 50-meter scale. I don't know where the data's gone. I'll tell you where it's gone privately. Make sure you use microphones when you ask your question. General Director of CAS Geodesy, you mentioned cadastres, and you said openness of data. I mean, confidentiality, top secrets. I mean, how do you work around that?
If you could take GeoPortal and view your data. Yes, thank you for your question. Indeed, I would have divided into two different things. Openness and free of charge data are two different things. Open data are available on our sub-agency infrastructure of spatial data, Many of you know this as SNI-GAIC. This is the resource. This is the leading organization, federal resource of spatial data. So there is a list of materials, how you can get access to it, so you can also read it on the web page. We have cartograms. You can view them. Openness of data is quite a painful issue, without which the industry is having a hard time developing, like the Earth remote sensing industry or the use of mapping materials are unlikely to develop quickly enough. But that's a serious question. Both Roscosmos and Roscartography are working on this, and naturally we need to constantly redefine our principles and approaches on how we work with open and closed data, because the list of closed data is a major restraining factor for the development of the industry, and we have to work on that, because there is some conviction shared by many, because the spatial data as coordinates, it doesn't always make sense to close them down or make confidential, because under the current level of Earth remote sensing systems at different levels, from space down to UAV levels, perhaps some requirements need to be redefined, because what was relevant, say, 50 years ago is no longer relevant, or doesn't make any more sense. We see that these data are available in open source, but sometimes we make it look like we're still closing what doesn't make any sense to close, which you can find in many other alternative sources. This is just a professional work that we need to continue doing, and we need to strike a balance between the national security of the state, and I'm talking about the Russian Federation now, but I'm sure that any country has the concerns of national security and secrecy, but still we need to redefine them. But open data, again, I repeat, are made available on the web page. I didn't think about putting a link on my presentation, but they are there. Thank you. Will there be further questions, dear colleagues? Paul Bourbon, Roscartography, Veliki Novgorod. The stereo model and stereo method as getting additional information is quite clear. I'm interested in a different aspect of this matter. You said that both state authorities will be using stereo model, but for that you need two elements, like hardware and people. Does it mean that architecture departments and cadastral agencies will be building specialized departments who will be able to use, visualize them, or am I wrong? Or you're going to simply view it as customers? Thank you for your question. I think special working stations will be created, especially in those areas where, which I mentioned in my report, operators' working stations have been bought, and they're working with the stereo model. They define the coordinates for all the needs and purposes. The Federal Cadastre Chamber, where I used to work about a year ago, we also did this work, and we bought working stations, a number of working stations, to better understand the capacities of the method. Now the changes in the legislation have been made, and the Cadastre Chamber has the right to correct the cadastre errors, so they're called registry errors, to also define the coordinates. And if we continue using these methods in those places where we have fresh recent materials, stereo photo models and orthophoto plans, of course we'll buy working stations and working places, and Rosreestr will do this work as well. And municipalities, whenever the work is done, they are also buying working stations and are actively using it. More questions, colleagues? Hello? Soy Mikhailov. Now Rosreestr is actively working on monitoring of squatter sites in Moscow region. But my question is about precision. Do you do georeferencing, or when you use UAVs, you do it without georeferencing? If you do it without georeferencing to control points, because there is no control points in those squatter sites, or first you do the control points and then you do the flyovers. Maybe you mentioned the project that was started by Rosreestr about the land supervision. Yes, we have procured UAVs for that. The method, I'm unfamiliar with the results of the methodology, but I suspect that your questions are quite justified. We do need special methodologies on how to do it properly. A small side note here. In all the methods which are used by cadastre engineers and other coordinates people, like geodesical methods and cartographic and mapping methods, we don't unfortunately have a lot of guidelines, and I'm putting it mildly. And this is exactly what professional community is supposed to do. And as far as photogrammetry is concerned, I know that MIGAIC and Geodesic Center and Geodesy Center and Cartography are planning to develop a national standard. And if everything works out fine, next year we'll have in place a national standard on photogrammetric methods, and which will contain the answer to your question. Now, the problem is that everybody is doing it to the best of their knowledge. It might work out fine, it might not work out so fine, but we don't have an instrument to check or verify it. Thank you. More questions for the speaker? We have just time for one, maybe two question stops. See, no more questions? Konstantin Alexandrovich, Wobolev Alexander, Roscartography. I have two small questions. First is the procedural question. Is there a procedure of visualizing an ArcGIS ArcGRN about the data of the models to make them in ArcGIS? Which area can be assessed by one of the methods? And the second question, in your presentation, you mentioned the top ceiling on the application of different flying models, but there are areas where we have problematic situation with the uncontoured places with very small land plots, 2 or 3 of them. How many land plots and from what kilometers do you think it makes sense to use FLS? Or maybe ground point or geodesy would make more sense in some of such cases. You mentioned the GIS-FRN system that we use for real property registry. We have a service map used by the rights registration bodies, and the public cadastral map. There is such a notion as cartographic foundation. You know what cartographic foundation we have. It could be digital maps and plans, and we can upload digital city plans, and in some cases we have larger scale. And orthophotos, orthophoto coverage, mostly done by satellite imagery. You can select, there are 2 options there. As a result, how to technologically do this and how to legally upload the data, metadata about the existence of a stereophoto model of this particular location. We haven't even discussed it yet, jumping ahead of myself, but life will push us to make it happen sooner or later. And the economic, or rather technological sense in this can be viewed from different angles. Which is the smallest number of points that it makes sense to study remotely or in a ground-based way. Each case has its own justification, but it depends on the many things, on the remoteness and the size of the site. But for UAVs, it is quite possible the size of a standard land plot would already make sense for them to be used. If it is 2, 3, 10 different land plots, it does make sense. There are such approaches anyway, even for UAVs, but we need to calculate. I think the problem is mostly, or not a problem, but the discussion is mostly about where to use UAVs and where to use piloted aircraft, because we're talking about economy and safety like can one fly UAVs over large cities, or the season of the year when there are no leaves on the trees, but there is no snow cover yet. So all these things are used for calculation and decision making. For me personally, it is obvious that small residential areas and villages or land plots can be done quite well by UAVs. If we're talking about larger cities, if we're talking about all-out coverage of intercity areas, maybe piloted aviation will do it better. Okay, colleagues, we have gone through all the time. Thank you very much.